The couple texts by Nora Akawi, Transversing Territories, in the case of the traveller, are of narratives regarding the current political and cultural sphere amidst conflict within Arab cities. Akawi, referencing the works of Jacques Rancière, Felicity Scott and Edward Said, gazes upon these recent events of conflict and provides a polemic on the role the current educational system has had in contributing to the crises due to the implication of its authoritarianism within collegiate environments. She argues these systems practiced in schools are not only reflective but imperative to current political conditions, thus warranting an immediate period of transition within the culture of education. Regarding the text, we'll be introducing 4 topics. The role of architecture as a representational medium of society. Secondly, the potential argument against the text as a form of denial of culture, and exclusion as a form of violence. And finally, the idea of identity throughout the text and the transition in approaching the term from a modernistic outlook to that of a postmodernistic outlook.
Well, let us talk about our first point. It is the role of architecture as a representational medium of society. We think architecture actually represents something unphysical. It might be national culture, social customs, local environment, regional religion, and maybe something else. In the text, Felicity Scott argued that we should rethink architecture's role as facilitating stabilization and unification in nation building, which is based on the assumption that architecture is potentially powerful social maker. For example, there are many national buildings called Soviet architecture in Russia and North Korea. They are famous for their scale and materiality, which commonly means huge, massive, and monolithic. To some degree, they obviously represent the power and force of national authority. What's more, in the presentation, Nora Akawi mentioned that the city is not only for the present, but also for the future. So the representation of architecture in our city should be inseparable between the future and the present. Architects and governments should take projection, imagination, appropriation, and capitalization into their consideration. So, what should architecture pursue? Based on the assumption that architecture serves as a medium and practice of social and political shaper for the present and future. In the text, Akawi is advocating for a reduction in the type of nationalistic style and substitute with a multiplicity of styles that is representative of our current diverse society. This leads us onto our next point, which is that a denial of nationalistic style or architecture can from a different angle be seen as a denial of culture. If we have one thing, we as people of different races and ethnicities can share with one another. It is our distinctive cultures. Respective of our origins. However, if the discipline of architecture progresses with a pattern in which we lose the traditional sense of regional style or vernacular, could this in some ways be seen as a denial of cultures? For instance, in the process of Chinese urbanization, too many cities just rigidly followed existing Western city structure, leading to too many familiar cities which is detached to their own context and their local culture. As you know, Beijing demolished its hundreds of years great city wall and built many modern glass blocks in the city, which made it lose the balance between the tradition and modernization. In contrast, a pretty good example of this point is RCR Architect, which won the Pritzker Prize this year. They strike a good balance between the local context and modern construction. For example, various materials are utilized reasonable and poetic in their buildings. They always use local wood or stone to construct an emotional space and use steel or glass to create other clean and transparent modern space. Localism and globalization are connected well in their projects.
Cada lugar tiene su propia magia, ¿no? Y lo que es más interesante o lo que de alguna manera acaba como motivando más es descubrir dónde está el tesoro de este lugar, ¿no? Claro. Dónde está la magia. Porque al final dices, en qué te fijas y en qué no te fijas, ¿no? Y qué es lo que tú quieres de allí hacer florecer y qué es lo que quieres mitigar, ¿no? Y qué relación vas a establecer con este lugar para que esto pase.
We deny no difference. We deny mandatory nationalism, but we don't deny local culture and genius loci.
And leading on to our third point is that exclusivity is a form of violence. In the text, Akawi references exclusivity in collegiate environments as a form of violence, putting in direct comparison with physical violence that is occurring in those regions. This puts into perspective the severity of the dangers and consequences that could occur as a result of exclusivity with regards to authoritarianism and the threat to freedom of speech and expression of ideas, in other words, democracy, and hence why she is advocating for academic freedom. The academic freedom Akawi is introducing can be described accompanied by the difference in definitions between borders and boundaries. In a text called The Open City, Stephen Gould gives a description defining the differences between the terms boundaries and borders. He characterizes them as both edges. However, he describes boundaries as edges of separation that prevents ends from migrating over. In contrast, he calls borders as zones of difference, but where those differences meet and become interactive. The academic freedom in question is here essentially one of borders. Currently, it is set by boundaries separating points of views, where one side is most often dominant over another, and thus completely excluding the ideas from the sphere of education. Akawi introduces a system of education set by boundaries, where everyone acknowledges the pluralistic culture, diversity, and differences between one another. However, all within an environment that encourages those differences to constantly interact harmoniously and sometimes antithetically in order to essentially learn from one another, taking on the role of migrants within foreign settings. This leads us on to our final point, being that transition with regards to the way in which we approach the idea of identities from modern into a culture of postmodernism. If we take Frederick Jameson's definition of modernism and postmodernism, for example, he describes both as being defined by the term differentiation. However, differentiation takes on contrasting meanings on the two different contexts. In modernism, differentiation was a relationship between figures, a figure-to-figure relationship. Architecturally, all figures and objects had their own functions, meaning, and purpose of existence that was different from the next. Thus, in modernism, differentiation was created between a figure-to-figure. In postmodernism, however, differentiation occurs even within single figures and objects. It is the idea of subjective relativity, and that different people will have different ideas on one object or figure based on their subjective origins, values, knowledge, and experiences. Thus, the figure and its functions can be appropriated and adapted into an infinite number of possibilities. With regards to the new culture of education that Akawi is advocating for, it is essentially one that adopts the culture of subjective relativity that exists within postmodern ideologies, opening up both the teaching and taught to acknowledge the possibility of differences and diverse and multiple ideas on all topics. It denies a bias and authoritative dominance within the collegiate environment, which is what currently leads into the cases of exclusion. In some ways, the text is only using the Arab cities to contextualize the author's thoughts with regards to the dangers of authoritarian collegiate environments, as those cities provide us with extreme conditions and examples of the subject in question. However, it would seem Akawi is wanting to provide awareness as to these patterns of exclusion in education as a general form of pattern that may be occurring in many other parts of the world. Even in the US, if we take examples of public schools not allowing extreme right or left-wing speakers to speak on their premises, we can witness examples of cases that represent exclusion and subjugation of ideas, which is essentially a form of threat to the freedom of speech and democracy. The relevance of architecture in the text is essentially one of representation and challenges the general architectural profession to think more critically about how cultural and regional architecture can represent diversity and exist without being dominated by a single style or vernacular.